In the hills of Breathitt County, stories still linger about a man named William Powell, a farmer turned outlaw after a single hard winter in 1891. According to newspaper accounts, Powell led a night of fire.
Mountain Midget. Billy Powell seized 19 jails after deputies hanged his 16-year-old daughter. The most audacious campaign against the American penal system in history, and the most systematic act of paternal vengeance the Appalachian Mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of the Mountain Midget. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Clay County, Kentucky, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the Commonwealth. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into violence. Hemmed in by the ancient Cumberland Plateau, the people who lived along the South Fork of the Kentucky River and its countless tributaries had been fighting for survival since the first settlers arrived. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation had continued that fight. There were no telephones in most of these hollows, even into the 20th century, and the roads were few, and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most lawless and ungovernable sections in all of America. From the early period, when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up, through the feuds that had torn these communities apart, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This no doubt has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. The jails that dotted the region were symbols of an authority that the mountain people had never fully accepted, buildings that represented a system imposed from outside rather than grown from within. When a man was locked in one of those jails, he was being held by a power that his community did not recognize and would not respect. You see, in these mountains, the jails were not seen as instruments of justice, but as tools of oppression. They held men who had made whiskey the way their fathers had made it, men who had defended their families according to codes that predated any written law, men whose only crimes were refusing to bow to authorities they had never elected and laws they had never endorsed. The sheriffs and deputies who operated these jails were often corrupt, using their positions to settle personal scores and to serve the interests of the powerful. To many mountain people, the jail was not a place where criminals were held, but a place where free men were caged by enemies who wore badges. The man who would become known as the Mountain Midget was born William Robert Powell in 1862, in a cabin on the banks of Goose Creek that his grandfather had built with his own hands. He was called Mountain Midget, not as an insult, but as a description, standing just 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighing no more than 95 pounds, even in his prime. Billy Powell was the smallest adult man anyone in Clay County had ever seen, a condition caused by some affliction of his bones that had stunted his growth while leaving his mind sharp and his spirit unbroken. But what Billy Powell lacked in physical stature, he made up for in other qualities that mattered more in these mountains. That's right. Billy Powell had learned early in life that he could not compete with other men in tests of strength or endurance. Nature had denied him the body that would have made such competition possible. But he had discovered other paths to respect and influence, other ways to make himself valuable to a community that might otherwise have dismissed him as a curiosity or a burden. He had become the finest gunsmith in Clay County, a craftsman whose work was sought by men throughout the region, who understood that a well-made weapon could mean the difference between life and death. His workshop was legendary throughout the mountains, a small building behind his cabin where he performed feats of mechanical precision that seemed almost magical to those who watched him work. He could take a broken weapon that others had given up on and restore it to perfect function. He could modify a rifle to shoot straighter than its manufacturer had ever intended. He could craft custom firearms from raw materials, building weapons to the exact specifications that each customer required. His hands, though attached to arms that seemed too short and too weak, were capable of work that no other hands in the region could match. The workshop itself was a marvel of organization and efficiency, designed by Billy to accommodate his small stature while maximizing his productivity. Workbenches were built at heights that would have required taller men to stoop uncomfortably, Tools were arranged on walls within easy reach of his short arms. Specialized fixtures held pieces steady while he worked on them, compensating for the leverage that his small body could not provide. Every detail of the space had been considered and optimized, transformed by Billy's ingenuity into an environment where his size was an advantage rather than a limitation. People came from 3 counties away to have their weapons serviced by Billy Powell. They waited weeks for an appointment, understanding that work of such quality could not be rushed. They paid prices that would have been considered outrageous for any other gunsmith, understanding that Billy's work was worth whatever he chose to charge. His reputation had spread throughout eastern Kentucky and into Tennessee and Virginia, drawing customers who made journeys of 100 miles or more to place their firearms in his extraordinary hands. The income from his gunsmithing had made Billy comfortable by mountain standards, though he lived simply and saved most of what he earned. He had purchased additional land around his original homestead, had built a larger cabin for the family he hoped to have someday, had accumulated resources that gave him independence from the economic pressures that kept most mountain people in poverty. His success was a testament to what determination and intelligence could accomplish, proof that a man's worth was measured by his abilities rather than his appearance. Beyond his skill as a gunsmith, Billy had developed a reputation as a man who could solve problems that others could not. He thought differently than most people, saw angles and possibilities that escaped conventional minds, found solutions that seemed obvious only after he had revealed them. People came to him with disputes that needed resolution, with puzzles that needed solving, with situations that seemed impossible until Billy Powell applied his peculiar genius to them. He had become, in his own quiet way, one of the most influential men in Clay County. Billy's marriage to a woman named Martha Collins in 1885 had been a surprise to everyone, including Billy himself. Martha was a widow with a small daughter, a woman of normal height and considerable beauty, who could have had her choice of any unmarried man in the county. But she had seen something in Billy that others missed, had recognized the quality of mind and spirit that his small body concealed. Their marriage was happy beyond anything either had expected, and when Martha's daughter died of fever the following year, they had mourned together and then begun building a new family. The child of that marriage was a daughter named Sarah, born in 1887, and she became the center of Billy Powell's universe. Sarah inherited her mother's height and beauty, growing into a young woman who towered over her father by the time she reached adolescence. But she had also inherited something of her father's mind, his quick wit and his ability to see solutions that others missed. She adored her father without reservation, saw past his small stature to the giant of a man who lived within, and Billy loved her with an intensity that those who knew him found almost frightening. By 1903, Sarah Powell was 16 years old and the acknowledged beauty of Clay County. Young men came from throughout the region seeking her attention, drawn by her appearance and charmed by her intelligence. She handled their attentions with a grace that made her father proud, never encouraging false hopes, but never delivering unnecessary cruelty. She had her father's gift for finding the right path through difficult situations, the diplomatic skill that had made Billy Powell valuable to so many people over the years. The trouble that would destroy this family began with a young man named James Hargis, the son of the most powerful political family in the county. James had become obsessed with Sarah Powell, had convinced himself that she would eventually recognize his superiority and accept his suit. Sarah had tried to discourage his attentions gently, had made clear that she was not interested, without delivering the public humiliation that might have provoked his family's wrath. But James Hargis was not accustomed to being denied, and his obsession had curdled into something darker as Sarah continued to reject him. Now, to understand what happened in the summer of 1903, you need to understand the nature of power in Clay County at that time. That's right, the Hargis family had controlled local politics for decades, placing their allies in every position of authority from the sheriff's office to the county court. They owned the general store, held mortgages on half the farms in the county, and employed a network of deputies who enforced their will with minimal regard for law or justice. Crossing the Hargis family was dangerous, and defying them openly was suicide. Everyone in Clay County understood this reality, and most people arranged their lives to avoid conflict with the family that held so much power. Billy Powell had navigated these treacherous waters carefully throughout his adult life. He had never allied himself with the Hargis family, had maintained his independence through a combination of usefulness and discretion. His skills as a gunsmith made him valuable to everyone, including the Hargis allies who needed their weapons maintained. His reputation as a solver of problems made him someone that even the powerful found it wise to respect. He had carved out a space for himself and his family that the Hargis family had generally left undisturbed. But James Hargis's obsession with Sarah changed everything. The young man could not accept that the daughter of a deformed dwarf would reject the son of the most powerful family in the county. His wounded pride demanded satisfaction, and the satisfaction he sought would destroy innocent people in ways that even his own family had not anticipated. And that's when James Hargis accused Sarah Powell of theft, claiming that she had stolen a valuable piece of jewelry from his mother's bedroom. You see, the accusation was entirely fabricated, a lie designed to accomplish what James's courtship had failed to achieve. The jewelry in question had never been stolen, had in fact been planted in Sarah's belongings by one of the Hargis household servants who had been paid to do so. James understood that the accusation would give him power over Sarah, would force her to accept his protection as the only alternative to prosecution and imprisonment. He was not interested in seeing her punished. He was interested in owning her. The plan went wrong almost immediately, in ways that James had not anticipated and could not control. His father, Judge Hargis, had learned of the accusation and had decided to use it for his own purposes. The judge had been looking for an opportunity to humble Billy Powell, whose independence had always irritated him and whose refusal to become a Hargis ally had been interpreted as a personal slight. The prosecution of Sarah would serve multiple purposes. It would punish Billy for his independence. It would demonstrate the consequences of refusing Hargis authority, and it would provide entertainment for a man whose cruelty had become legendary throughout the region. Judge Hargis took personal control of the case, ensuring that the charges against Sarah were far more serious than simple theft. He manufactured evidence suggesting that Sarah had been part of a larger conspiracy, that she had been stealing from multiple families throughout the county, that her crimes represented a pattern of behavior that demanded severe punishment. The charge was elevated from simple theft to grand larceny, a crime that carried the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. The trial was held in the Clay County Courthouse, in a room dominated by a portrait of Judge Hargis's father that seemed to watch the proceedings with cold approval. Billy Powell attended every session, his small frame barely visible above the railing of the spectator section, his face a mask that concealed emotions too powerful to express. He had hired the best lawyer he could afford, had gathered witnesses who could testify to Sarah's character, had prepared every defense that his quick mind could devise. None of it mattered. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial, with spectators filling every seat and lining the walls. Some had come out of morbid curiosity, drawn by the scandal of a beautiful young woman accused of theft from the most powerful family in the county. Others had come to support Sarah, neighbors and friends who knew her character, and could not believe the accusations against her. Still others had come simply to witness the spectacle, understanding that whatever happened in this courtroom would be talked about for generations. Billy sat in the same seat every day, directly behind the defense table, where he could see his daughter's face and where she could draw strength from his presence. He had dressed in his best clothes, had trimmed his beard neatly, had done everything he could to present himself as a respectable citizen whose daughter could not possibly be a criminal. His small body seemed even smaller in the formal setting of the courtroom, surrounded by men who towered over him, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made even the bailiffs uncomfortable. Sarah conducted herself with a dignity that made her father proud, answering questions calmly and clearly, never losing her composure despite the obvious hostility of the prosecutor. She denied every accusation, explained her whereabouts on the dates when the alleged thefts had occurred, challenged the testimony of witnesses who she had never seen before in her life. Her intelligence was evident in every response, her innocence obvious to anyone who was not already determined to find her guilty. The prosecution presented its fabricated evidence with the confidence that came from knowing the verdict was predetermined. Witnesses testified to thefts that had never occurred, identified Sarah as the perpetrator of crimes that had been invented for the occasion, provided details that had been rehearsed until they seemed almost credible. The defense lawyer objected repeatedly, challenging testimony that contradicted itself and evidence that made no logical sense. Every objection was overruled by a judge who was not even pretending to be impartial. The jury, composed of men who owed their livelihoods to the Hargis family, deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty. Sarah stood silently as the verdict was read, her face as composed as her father's, refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her break. Billy watched from the gallery, his small hands gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white, knowing that whatever happened next would be beyond anything the charges against his daughter should have warranted. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. The courtroom erupted at the announcement, with even some of the Hargis supporters stunned by the severity of the sentence. Grand larceny was a serious crime, but it was almost never punished by death, especially when the accused was a young woman with no prior criminal history. The sentence was clearly designed not as punishment for Sarah's alleged crimes, but as a message to Billy Powell and to everyone else in Clay County about what happened to those who defied Hargis authority. Judge Hargis had decided to make an example that would be remembered for generations. The appeals process that followed was as corrupt as the trial itself. Billy spent every dollar he had saved, sold his workshop and his tools, begged money from everyone who owed him favors. His lawyers filed motions challenging the verdict, arguing that the sentence was grossly disproportionate and that the evidence against Sarah had been fabricated. Every motion was denied. Every argument was rejected. The judges who heard the appeals were either Hargis allies or men who feared the consequences of ruling against the family. The outcome was determined before the first paper was filed. The execution of Sarah Powell took place on a cold November morning in the yard behind the Clay County Jail. The gallows had been constructed specifically for the occasion, a wooden structure that seemed obscene in its newness, built to kill a girl whose only crime had been rejecting the wrong man's advances. A crowd had gathered to witness the hanging, some out of morbid curiosity, others to see justice done, still others to protest an execution they believed to be judicial murder. Billy Powell was there standing at the front of the crowd, his small frame almost invisible among the taller bodies that surrounded him. Billy had been denied a final meeting with his daughter, had been told that the condemned would see no visitors in the hours before execution. He had tried everything, had begged and threatened and offered bribes, had done things that shamed him in the desperate hope of one last moment with his child. Nothing had worked. He would watch Sarah die without being able to say goodbye, without being able to tell her one final time that he loved her, without being able to offer any comfort in her final moments. Sarah was brought from the jail just after 9 o'clock, her hands bound behind her back, her long hair loose around her shoulders. She walked to the scaffold with a dignity that made many in the crowd weep, refusing to show fear, refusing to give her executioners the satisfaction of seeing her broken. At the foot of the gallows, she stopped and scanned the crowd until her eyes found her father. For a moment, father and daughter looked at each other, communicating everything that could not be said in words. Then Sarah turned and climbed the steps to the platform where the noose was waiting. The execution was carried out with brutal efficiency. The trapdoor fell, the rope snapped taut, and Sarah Powell died without a sound. The crowd watched in silence as her body swung at the end of the rope, as the life left her and she became simply an object, a thing that had once been a girl with dreams and intelligence and a father who loved her. Billy did not look away, did not close his eyes, did not allow himself any escape from the reality of what was happening. He watched until Sarah was cut down and carried away, and then he walked out of town without speaking to anyone. The body was released to the family that evening, carried to the Powell homestead in a wagon driven by neighbors who had known Sarah since her birth. Billy walked behind the wagon for the entire journey, refusing all offers of a ride, maintaining a vigil that seemed to go beyond grief into something that had no name. Martha collapsed when she saw the body, her wails echoing through the hollow in a sound that those who heard it would never forget. Billy did not weep, did not wail, did not show any external sign of the transformation that was occurring within him. That night, After the body had been prepared for burial and the house had fallen silent, Billy Powell sat alone in his workshop and made a vow that would define the rest of his life. He would not kill the men who had murdered his daughter, though God knew they deserved to die. He would not burn their homes or destroy their property. He would strike at the heart of their power in a way that no one had ever attempted before. He would seize the jails, the physical symbols of the authority they had used to destroy his family. He would capture and hold the buildings that represented their power, would free whatever prisoners he found there, would demonstrate that the authority of the badge was an illusion that could be shattered by a man with nothing left to lose. And that vow, spoken over the memory of a girl who died for nothing, would be fulfilled beyond anything Billy Powell himself could have imagined. You see, Billy Powell didn't act impulsively despite his overwhelming grief and rage. That's right. He understood that emotion-driven action would only get him caught before he could accomplish his purpose. Instead, he spent the months following Sarah's execution planning his campaign with the same methodical care he had always applied to his gunsmith work. He studied the jails of eastern Kentucky, identified their vulnerabilities, developed plans for how each one could be taken and held. His mind, which had always been his greatest asset, now turned itself entirely to the problem of demonstrating that power had limits. The planning process took nearly a year, during which Billy maintained the appearance of a broken man who had accepted his family's defeat. He closed his workshop, withdrew from the community that had been unable to protect his daughter, lived as a hermit in his cabin on Goose Creek. No one suspected that behind the facade of defeat, a mind was working ceaselessly on problems of tactics and logistics and execution. Billy had always been underestimated because of his size. Now that tendency to overlook him would serve his purposes perfectly. The intelligence he gathered was comprehensive and detailed. He learned the layout of every jail within 100 miles, studied their construction, identified their weak points. He learned the schedules of the deputies who staffed them, the times when skeleton crews were on duty, the moments of vulnerability that every institution has. He studied the weapons that were kept in each jail, the locks that secured their doors, the alarm systems that were supposed to summon help. By the time he was ready to act, he knew more about these jails than the men who worked in them every day. His small size, which had been a limitation his entire life, became an asset in this planning phase. He could approach buildings without being noticed, could peer through windows that were too high for most men to reach, by standing on objects that would not support a larger person's weight. He could move through communities without attracting attention, a tiny figure that people's eyes simply passed over. He was invisible in a way that no normal-sized man could ever be. The weapons he prepared for his campaign were as carefully considered as everything else in his plan. He selected firearms that he could handle effectively despite his small stature, modified them to suit his particular needs, created a personal arsenal that would give him advantages his enemies would not expect. He built special holsters that allowed him to carry weapons concealed, designed mechanisms that would let him reload faster than an opponent would anticipate. Every detail was considered, every contingency planned for. The list of targets that Billy compiled eventually numbered 19 jails across 7 counties. Some had been directly involved in Sarah's case, holding her during her trial or participating in her execution. Others served the political networks that had enabled the Hargis family to maintain their grip on regional justice. Still others were selected for their symbolic significance, buildings that represented the corruption and cruelty that Billy had come to see as endemic to the entire system. Each target was chosen with care, each attack planned with attention to detail that left nothing to chance. The first jail was seized on the first anniversary of Sarah's execution, a date that Billy had marked from the beginning as the start of his campaign. The target was the Clay County Jail itself, the building where his daughter had spent her final nights, where she had been held while awaiting the execution that should never have happened. It was the most symbolic target on his list, and also one of the most challenging, located in the center of Manchester, and staffed around the clock by deputies who understood they were potential targets for anyone seeking revenge against the Hargis family. Billy had studied this building more thoroughly than any other target on his list. He knew every brick of its construction, every bar on its windows, every lock on its doors. He knew the names and habits of every deputy who worked there, knew their schedules and their weaknesses and their fears. He had spent months preparing for this moment, rehearsing every step of the operation in his mind until he could execute it without conscious thought. The night he chose for the seizure was cold and moonless, with a wind that covered any sounds of movement and that kept most people indoors. Billy had waited for exactly these conditions, understanding that weather was as much a weapon as any firearm. He moved through the streets of Manchester like a ghost, his small body invisible in the darkness, his footsteps making no sound on the frozen ground. Billy approached the jail just after midnight, moving through shadows that seemed to welcome him, his small body invisible in the darkness. He had studied the building for months, had identified a basement window that was too small for a normal man to enter, but perfectly sized for someone of his dimensions. The window had been installed to provide ventilation for the basement storage area, and no one had ever imagined that it might serve as an entry point for an attack. No one except Billy Powell, whose mind had been trained by a lifetime of finding opportunities that others missed. He had mapped the interior so completely that he could navigate it in total darkness, knew exactly where each deputy would be stationed, understood the precise sequence of actions that would give him control of the building. He had rehearsed this sequence hundreds of times, working through every possible variation, preparing contingencies for complications that might arise. By the time he slipped through that basement window, he knew exactly what he would do and exactly how he would do it. The entry was accomplished in seconds. His small frame slipping through the window like smoke, his feet touching the basement floor without making a sound. He moved through the building with a speed and precision that his enemies never anticipated, neutralizing each deputy before they could raise an alarm. He did not kill them, had promised himself that he would not become the thing he was fighting against, but he disabled them with the efficiency that left no possibility of resistance. Within 15 minutes, Billy Powell controlled the Clay County Jail. The prisoners who were being held in the jail that night numbered 7, men who had been arrested on various charges and who were awaiting trial or transfer. Billy released them all, giving each man a choice: leave immediately and tell no one what had happened, or stay and help him hold the building against whatever response might come. 3 chose to leave, disappearing into the night. 4 chose to stay, recognizing in Billy's campaign something that resonated with their own grievances against the system that had imprisoned them. The response came at dawn, when a deputy who had been off duty arrived to begin his shift and found the jail in the hands of Billy Powell. The deputy fled to summon help, and within an hour, a force of 20 armed men had surrounded the building. They demanded that Billy surrender, promised leniency if he released his hostages and gave himself up. Billy responded by releasing the deputies he had captured, sending them out one by one with a message for their colleagues. The jail belonged to him now, and it would remain in his hands until he chose to leave. The standoff lasted 3 days, during which Billy and his 4 allies held the jail against every attempt to retake it. The authorities tried negotiation, tried intimidation, tried everything except the direct assault that might have succeeded, but would certainly have resulted in casualties they were not prepared to accept. Billy had fortified the building well, had positioned his defenders at points that commanded every approach, had demonstrated through carefully placed shots that any attack would be costly. On the 4th morning, Billy and his allies slipped out of the jail through a tunnel they had discovered during their occupation, a passage that connected to a nearby building and that the authorities had not known existed. They vanished into the mountains, leaving behind a building that had been stripped of weapons, ammunition, and anything else of value. The Clay County Jail stood empty, a monument to the audacity of a 4-foot-10-inch man who had defied the most powerful family in the region. The seizure of the Clay County Jail sent shockwaves through the political establishment of eastern Kentucky. Judge Hargis himself responded to the news with fury, ordering his deputies to hunt down Billy Powell and bring him back dead or alive. Rewards were offered, possess were formed, and every hollow and ridge in the region was searched for the Mountain Midget and his allies. But Billy had anticipated these measures and had prepared hiding places that his enemies would never find. The second jail was seized 3 weeks later, a smaller facility in a neighboring county that served as a holding point for prisoners being transferred to the state penitentiary. Billy and a growing band of followers took the building in the middle of the night, held it for 2 days, and then vanished before the response could be organized. The pattern was established, and the legend began to grow. That's right. Billy Powell continued his campaign through the winter and into the spring, seizing jails with a regularity that kept his enemies constantly off balance. The third target was in Leslie County, a facility that had held men convicted of moonshining by judges allied with the Hargis family. Billy and his growing band of followers took this jail on a snowy February night, holding it for 4 days, while blizzard conditions prevented any organized response. When the weather cleared, they had already vanished. The fourth target was in Perry County, a jail whose sheriff had provided testimony supporting Sarah's conviction. This sheriff had spoken at her trial, had vouched for the credibility of the witnesses who testified against her, had lent his authority to the prosecution's fabricated case. Billy wanted this man to understand the consequences of his actions, and the seizure of his jail delivered that message with unmistakable clarity. The fifth was in Owsley County, where political allies of Judge Hargis had used their jail to hold opponents of the family machine without charges or trial. Men had been locked in that jail for weeks or months simply because they had offended someone in the Hargis network, held without any legal process, released only when they agreed to whatever terms their captors demanded. Billy freed a dozen such men during his seizure of the Owsley County jail, men who immediately joined his growing movement. The tactical innovations that Billy brought to each seizure became more sophisticated as his experience grew. He developed methods for cutting telegraph wires that would delay calls for help. He created diversions that would draw deputies away from their posts at critical moments. He established networks of scouts who would warn him of approaching threats. Each seizure taught him something new, and he incorporated those lessons into the planning for subsequent operations. The force that followed Billy grew larger with each successful action. Men who had been freed from the jails he seized often chose to stay with him, understanding that they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. Men from the surrounding communities joined as well, drawn by the legend that was growing around the Mountain Midget, inspired by his success against enemies that had seemed invincible. By the spring of 1905, Billy commanded a force of nearly 50 men, enough to take on almost any target he chose. Each seizure followed a pattern that Billy had refined through experience. He would study the target for weeks, learning every detail of its operation. He would recruit allies from among the men he had previously freed, building a force that grew larger with each successful action. He would strike at night, when the jails were minimally staffed and the towns were quiet. He would hold the building for as long as possible, releasing whatever prisoners he found and stripping the facility of weapons and supplies. And when the pressure became too great, he would vanish into the mountains through escape routes he had prepared in advance. The investigation into the jail seizures became the largest in Kentucky history, with state militia joining local authorities in a desperate effort to capture the Mountain Midget. The governor himself took an interest in the case, understanding that the systematic capture of jails represented a challenge to the authority of the state itself. He directed additional resources to the investigation, brought in detectives from Louisville who had experience with organized criminal activity, and demanded regular reports on the progress being made. Hundreds of people were questioned in the weeks and months following the first seizures. Anyone who had ever expressed sympathy for Billy Powell, anyone who had criticized the Hargis family, anyone who had been seen in areas where the Mountain Midget was rumored to operate, was brought in for interrogation. The investigators compiled lists of suspects that grew longer with each new seizure, adding names as theories developed and subtracting them as alibis were confirmed. The methods used in the seizures were analyzed by military officers who had been called in to advise the civilian authorities. They studied Billy's tactics, trying to identify patterns that might predict where he would strike next. They noted his preference for attacking at night, his use of diversions and deception, his ability to control buildings that should have been defensible. Their reports praised the sophistication of his operations, while offering few practical suggestions for how to stop him. Dozens were placed under surveillance, their movements monitored by investigators who hoped to catch them meeting with Billy or his lieutenants. Houses were watched, letters were intercepted, informants were recruited from among the prisoners who had been recaptured after Billy freed them. The surveillance produced mountains of information, but few useful leads. Billy's network was too well organized, his security procedures too effective, his people too loyal to be turned. Rewards were offered that grew larger with each new seizure, eventually reaching $5,000 for information leading to Billy's capture. Posters bearing his description were distributed throughout eastern Kentucky and beyond, promising riches to anyone who could deliver the Mountain Midget to justice. The rewards attracted bounty hunters from across the country, professional manhunters who believed they could succeed where local authorities had failed. None of them came close to capturing Billy Powell, but no useful leads emerged. Billy Powell had planned too carefully, had built a network of supporters too loyal to betray him, had developed methods of operation too sophisticated to leave evidence behind. The sixth seizure came in May 1905, capturing a jail that everyone had believed was impregnable. The building was constructed of stone, with barred windows and reinforced doors that should have resisted any assault. Billy found a weakness that no one had anticipated, a drainage pipe that was just large enough to admit his small body, and he emerged inside the building like a demon rising from hell. The guards surrendered without a fight, convinced that anyone who could enter their fortress through such a route must have supernatural abilities. The seventh and eighth seizures came in quick succession, demonstrating that Billy's campaign was accelerating rather than slowing down. The ninth came on Independence Day, a symbolic date that seemed designed to mock the authorities who had failed to stop him. By the end of summer 1905, 9 jails had been seized, and the law enforcement establishment of eastern Kentucky was in a state of near collapse. Judge Hargis's response to the crisis became increasingly desperate and counterproductive. He ordered mass arrests of anyone suspected of sympathizing with Billy, filled the remaining jails with men whose only crime was knowing someone who might know someone who might have helped the Mountain Midget. He imposed curfews that alienated communities that might otherwise have cooperated with the authorities. He made public statements threatening dire consequences for Billy and his supporters, statements that only increased Billy's popularity among people who had their own grievances against Hargis justice. The 10th seizure was the most audacious yet, targeting a jail in the town where Judge Hargis himself resided. Billy and his men took the building in the middle of the night, held it for a week against everything the authorities could throw at them, and then escaped through a network of tunnels that they had spent months preparing. The judge watched from his home as the siege unfolded, saw his deputies fail repeatedly to retake the building, and understood for the first time that he might not win this war. The campaign continued through the fall of 1905 and into 1906, with Billy striking whenever opportunity presented itself. The 11th jail fell in October, the 12th in December, the 13th in February of the new year, the 14th in April. The pattern seemed to have no end, no limit, no objective that could be identified and addressed. The seizures would continue until someone stopped them, and no one knew how to stop a man who could appear anywhere and vanish like smoke. By the spring of 1906, 14 jails had been seized, and the political landscape of eastern Kentucky had been transformed. The Hargis family's grip on power was slipping, weakened by their inability to protect even their own jails from a man they had wronged. Other families that had been cowed by Hargis authority began to assert themselves, sensing that the old order was crumbling. The state government in Frankfort began to take notice, sending investigators who asked uncomfortable questions about how the Hargis machine had been allowed to operate for so long. The 15th seizure coincided with the 3rd anniversary of Sarah's execution, a symbolic date that Billy had marked from the beginning. He took the jail where his daughter had been held during her trial, held it for 10 days against every attempt to retake it, and then walked out the front door in broad daylight, daring anyone to stop him. No one did. The deputies who had surrounded the building parted to let him pass, unwilling to fire on a man whose cause had captured the imagination of the entire region. The 16th, 17th, and 18th seizures came in rapid succession over the following months, each one demonstrating Billy's ability to strike wherever and whenever he chose. The investigation had long since ground to a halt, its resources exhausted, its leads all dead ends. The authorities had effectively conceded that they could not catch Billy Powell, could only try to protect specific targets and hope that he would eventually grow tired or make a mistake. The 19th and final seizure came in November 1906, exactly 3 years after Sarah's execution and 1 year after the campaign had begun. The target was the jail that had been built to replace the first one Billy had seized, a new facility that was supposed to be impossible to take. Billy proved that nothing was impossible for a man with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He held the building for 2 weeks, longer than any previous seizure, and then released it voluntarily with a message for Judge Hargis. The debt was paid, the campaign was over, and Billy Powell was done with war. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Billy Powell never seized another jail after that November night in 1906. He had accomplished what he set out to do, had demonstrated that the power of the badge was an illusion, had humiliated the family that had murdered his daughter. The prisoners he had freed over 3 years numbered in the hundreds, men who scattered across the mountains and beyond, carrying the story of the Mountain Midget wherever they went. The weapons and supplies he had captured had armed a resistance that continued long after his campaign ended, a network of people who had learned that authority could be challenged and that the powerful were not invincible. The aftermath of Billy's campaign reshaped law enforcement in eastern Kentucky for a generation. Judge Hargis was removed from the bench in 1907, his career destroyed by investigations that had been triggered by Billy's actions. The judge had been untouchable for decades, protected by political connections and by the fear that his power inspired. But Billy's campaign had demonstrated that he could be challenged, had shown that his authority was not absolute, and that revelation had emboldened others who had grievances against the Hargis machine. The investigation that eventually removed Judge Hargis from the bench uncovered decades of corruption that had been hidden by the family's control of local institutions. Fabricated charges, perjured testimony, bribes paid and received, verdicts purchased by the highest bidder. All of it came to light in the months following Billy's campaign. Newspapers throughout Kentucky published exposés that detailed the systematic abuse of power that had characterized Hargis' rule, and public opinion that had once tolerated the family's dominance turned decisively against them. The political machine he had built collapsed without his leadership, its allies abandoning a cause that had become toxic. Deputies who had enforced Hargis found themselves unemployed, their badges stripped by new authorities who wanted nothing to do with the old regime. Judges who had rubber-stamped Hargis verdicts were removed or resigned, replaced by men who promised to administer justice impartially. The transformation was not complete, could never be complete, but it represented genuine change from the system that had murdered Sarah Powell. The reforms that followed were imperfect and incomplete, but they represented genuine change, an acknowledgement that the old ways could not continue. New oversight mechanisms were established to prevent the concentration of power that had enabled the Hargis family's abuses. Election procedures were reformed to reduce the influence of political machines. The state government took a more active role in supervising county-level justice, reducing the autonomy that had allowed corruption to flourish. The jails that Billy had seized were rebuilt and restaffed, but they were never again seen as symbols of unchallengeable authority. The men who guarded them knew that they could be taken, that their power depended on the consent of communities that might withdraw that consent at any moment. The balance between the authorities and the people they governed had shifted, and it would never entirely shift back. Billy Powell lived another 23 years after his campaign ended, dying peacefully in his bed in 1929 at the age of 67. He had returned to his work as a gunsmith after the seizures ended, rebuilding his workshop and his reputation, becoming once again the man who could fix anything and solve any problem. He never spoke publicly about his campaign, never sought recognition for what he had accomplished, never explained his methods or his motivations to the journalists and historians who came seeking interviews. The transition from warrior to craftsman was easier than Billy had expected. The skills that had made him a successful gunsmith before Sarah's death remained intact, and his reputation had only grown during the years of his campaign. Customers who might once have been uncertain about bringing their weapons to a man of his unusual appearance now sought him out specifically because of who he was, wanting to say that their rifle had been serviced by the legendary Mountain Midget. The years following the campaign were remarkably peaceful for Billy Powell. The authorities, who might have prosecuted him, chose not to, understanding that arresting the Mountain Midget would only create a martyr and possibly restart the resistance that had finally quieted. The Hargis family, stripped of their political power, had no means of pursuing personal vengeance. Billy was left alone to live out his days in the hollow where his daughter was buried, visiting her grave every evening to tell her about the events of the day. His conversations with Sarah at her graveside became legendary in the hollow. Neighbors would see him walking up the hillside every evening just before sunset, would watch him stand at the grave for an hour or more, his small figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. They could see his lips moving, but could not hear what he said, could only imagine the words he spoke to the daughter who had been taken from him. Some thought it strange, even unhealthy, but most understood that grief takes different forms, and that Billy's visits to Sarah's grave were simply his way of maintaining a connection that death had not entirely broken. His wife Martha had died during the campaign, her health broken by grief and worry, and Billy lived alone in the years that followed. He never remarried, never showed interest in any woman after Martha's death, devoted what remained of his life to work and memory. The cabin felt empty without Martha's presence, without Sarah's laughter, but Billy maintained it carefully, keeping everything as it had been when his family was still alive. Neighbors checked on him regularly, bringing food and companionship, repaying in small ways the enormous debt they felt they owed to the man who had challenged the Hargis family and won. Young men came to learn gunsmithing from him, apprenticing in his workshop and carrying his techniques to other communities. Children who had heard the stories of the Mountain Midget came to see the legend for themselves, surprised to discover that the fearsome warrior was a kind old man who gave them candy and told them stories about the old days. In his final years, Billy became something of a beloved figure in Clay County, the small, clever man who had defied the powerful and prevailed. His workshop remained busy until the end, his hands steady enough to do precision work even as his health declined. He died in his sleep on a cold January night, passing from one world to the next without pain or fear, joining at last the wife and daughter who had been waiting for him. The grave of Sarah Powell became something of a pilgrimage site in the years following the campaign, visited by people who wanted to pay their respects to the girl whose death had sparked such extraordinary events. The stone that marked her resting place bore only her name and dates, but everyone who visited knew the larger story. Sarah had been 16 years old when she died, hanged for a crime she did not commit, murdered by a system that valued power over justice. Her father had answered that murder with a campaign that changed everything. Billy's own grave lies beside his daughter's, on the hillside above Goose Creek, where generations of Powells rest. His headstone bears no mention of the deeds that made him legendary, identifies him only as a beloved husband and father. But those who know the story make a point of visiting both graves, the daughter and the father who avenged her, understanding that their fates were intertwined in ways that death could not sever. The story of the Mountain Midget passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about him, ballads that celebrated his audacity and mourned the death of his daughter. Some portrayed him as a hero who had struck a blow against a corrupt system. Others painted him as a dangerous outlaw who had taken the law into his own hands. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Billy Powell story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with Sarah's arrest and ending with the final seizure. These songs named names, described specific jail takeovers, celebrated Billy's tactical genius in ways that made them almost instructional for anyone contemplating similar actions. Others focused on particular episodes, dramatizing specific jail takeovers or the long siege that had humiliated Judge Hargis. One popular ballad told the story of Billy's entry through the basement window of the Clay County Jail, describing how the tiny man had squeezed through an opening that no one else could have used. The song captured the moment when the first deputy realized that the jail had been taken, when he understood that the Mountain Midget was inside the building and that everything he thought he knew about security was wrong. The image of the small man emerging from the darkness to seize control became iconic, repeated in countless retellings. Another song focused on the relationship between Billy and Sarah, painting a portrait of a father's love that transcended death itself. The song described Billy's evening visits to Sarah's grave, imagined the conversations he had with his daughter, explored the grief that had transformed him from a peaceful craftsman into a warrior. It was more sentimental than the tactical ballads, appealing to audiences who connected with the emotional core of the story, rather than its military aspects. The most famous of these songs, known as the Mountain Midget's War, was composed in 1908 by a blind musician who had spent time in one of the jails Billy had seized. The musician had been imprisoned on fabricated charges similar to those that had condemned Sarah, and he had been freed when Billy's men took control of the facility. His gratitude infused every verse of the song, his personal experience lending authenticity to lyrics that might otherwise have seemed exaggerated. His song has been sung in these mountains for over a century, passed from generation to generation by musicians who learned it from their parents and grandparents. Historians who have studied the Billy Powell case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and its meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to corrupt authority, a response to a system that had become so compromised that it could murder a young woman with impunity. Others have focused on the tactical innovations that Billy brought to his campaign, studying his methods as examples of asymmetric warfare that anticipated techniques used in later conflicts. Still others have examined the political consequences, arguing that Billy's campaign contributed directly to the reforms that eventually dismantled the political machines of eastern Kentucky. You see, what Billy Powell did occupies a complex place in any moral framework. He seized government buildings by force, held law enforcement officers hostage, released prisoners who had been convicted through legitimate if corrupt processes. The fact that he killed no one during his campaign does not eliminate the violence inherent in his actions or the danger he created for everyone involved. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn the seizure of jails, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet his story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that vigilantism is wrong. He was a father whose 16-year-old daughter had been judicially murdered by men who faced no accountability through official channels. The courts that should have protected Sarah had instead killed her. The appeals that should have saved her had instead confirmed her sentence. There was no legitimate avenue for redress, no institution that would hold the murderers accountable. What options did Billy have? What would any father do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate justice? His story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The hanging of Sarah Powell was legal, carried out through proper procedures by authorized officials, but it was not just. It was murder, plain and simple, committed under color of law by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Billy Powell created accountability where none existed, demonstrated that power had limits, and forced changes that benefited everyone who lived under the justice system of eastern Kentucky. The specific circumstances that produced the Billy Powell story have changed in the decades since those jails were seized. The political machines that once controlled county governments have been weakened by reforms in election law and judicial selection. The corruption that allowed powerful families to use the courts as weapons against their enemies has been reduced, though not eliminated, by oversight mechanisms and ethical rules. The possibility of a young woman being executed for a fabricated crime simply because she rejected a powerful man's advances seems unthinkable today. But it was not unthinkable in 1903, and the story of Sarah Powell stands as a reminder of what can happen when systems of justice become instruments of oppression. But the underlying questions that Billy's story raises have not disappeared entirely. Law enforcement agencies still sometimes abuse their authority. Prosecutors still sometimes pursue charges that are more about politics than about justice. The gap between what the law promises and what it delivers remains wide enough to generate rage and despair in those who find themselves on the wrong side of that gap. The story of the Mountain Midget serves as a reminder of what can happen when that gap becomes unbridgeable, when people lose faith in institutions that are supposed to protect them. The descendants of Billy Powell still live in those Kentucky hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and complexity. Some have become law enforcement officers themselves, trying to reform the system from within, determined to ensure that what happened to Sarah never happens to another young woman. Others have become lawyers and advocates, working through legitimate channels to achieve the accountability that their ancestors sought through force. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred over a century ago, a campaign that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. Family reunions are held annually, gatherings that bring together descendants from across Kentucky and beyond. At these reunions, the story of Billy and Sarah is told to children who might otherwise forget. The details preserved through oral tradition, as they have been for over a century. The older members of the family can name every jail that Billy seized, can describe the tactics he used, can recount the investigation and his successful evasion of capture. The story has become sacred text, a founding myth that defines what it means to be a Powell. The site where the original Clay County Jail once stood is marked today by a modern facility that serves the same function but bears no resemblance to the building that Billy Powell seized on that November night in 1904. Few people who pass through Manchester today know the story of what happened there, of the girl who was hanged for a crime she did not commit, and the father who answered that injustice with a campaign that shook the foundations of power throughout eastern Kentucky. But the story is not forgotten in these mountains, passed down through families and preserved in songs that are still sung at gatherings and festivals. The mountains of Clay County remain today much as they were in 1903, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear, the trees still change color each autumn, the hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land for generations. The political machines that once controlled these communities have faded into history, remembered now mainly through stories and songs. Those who live in these hills still tell stories about the Mountain Midget, about the campaign that humbled the powerful, about what happens when authorities harm children and fathers decide to respond. The story of the Mountain Midget endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of paternal love, and what that love becomes when it is violated by unspeakable cruelty. It is the story of finding strength in what others see as weakness, of turning limitations into advantages. It is the story of power and its illusions, of systems that seem unbreakable until someone finds the courage to break them. It is finally a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where the Mountain Midget stood, to see the hollow where he lived, and the hillside where he and Sarah rest together? Would you walk the paths he walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hills since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollow where the Powell homestead stood is difficult to access without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it. That standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of the Mountain Midget close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. His story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Clay County in those terrible years. As long as fathers love their daughters with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as systems fail and people find ways to respond. He is gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hollow he loved. But what he did and what was done to his family echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of Billy Powell, the Mountain Midget, who seized 19 jails after deputies hanged his 16-year-old daughter Sarah for a crime she did not commit. A story of love and loss, of courage and determination, of justice found where the law could not provide it. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all.